going to do any grammar, then do it in the classroom, because the language lab you have on the outside. There are certain things you can only learn with a teacher and not through exposure. So in essence, they have that more or less flipped, I think, in the United States very often.
I also think it's important that the teachers in the classroom stick to the language.
Okay, so there we have a topic we discussed before.
I know of certain situations where 50% of the language spoken in the classroom is the mother language of the students.
Okay, and I'm going
to help the students too much.
Okay, so I'm going to defer this discussion to later, because one of the trends I'm going to be talking about has to do with multilingualism and plurilingualism. This is a debate we had a couple of days ago in another section. This is something that I have discussed with one of the people here, right here, Dalis. And this is very, our thinking about this has really changed. We used to say no first language in the foreign language classroom. Because of that, we said, you know, practice as much as possible, and you certainly don't want to revert back to the native language, because they get less practice, right? Now, we know from research today, and again, this is a little bit different in the ESL versus EFL situation. In the ESL situation, they get tons of practice. There's more of a reason to be a little lenient about this and to say, maybe L1 usage, first language. I'm using L1 and L2 for first language and second language. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that. But we're saying right now that in an ESL situation, it makes a lot of sense, if you can, to sometimes use the native language of the student, right? Now in EFL classrooms, it's slightly different, but we used to really frown upon this, but the thinking about this has really changed on this. And the reason why the thinking about this has really changed is that we know that yes, you need practice, and yes, you need exposure, but there is also research that shows, a big research study that was done at George Mason University in the United States, and was a very big study. 700,000 students were involved in this research. So a huge meta-analysis of all sorts of data. And what they found was that, what they concluded, the theoretical model that came out of the data, if you will, basically what they claimed was, they said students have both linguistic development. If you look at elementary and secondary school, particularly, maybe a little less so at post-secondary, but certainly in elementary school and in secondary school, high school, students have cognitive development and linguistic development, right? And this is done in immigrant communities in the United States. And what we're finding is that if you only focus on the language and the cognitive development falls behind, right? So the stuff that they're doing is much less difficult because we think they don't quite have the language. So we're focusing on language, but we're not engaging them cognitively very much, that their language is also held back. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So basically in the past we used to say, okay, we get immigrant students. In the 1960s we started the whole TESOL profession and whatever in the United States under the influence of the Cuban immigrants, basically. And what we did with those Cuban immigrants initially is we put them in a special classroom for a year, we pumped all the necessary ESL into them, English as a second language, and they were and we thought, and then we'll send them back to the regular classroom, and that works. Well, for them, for certain reasons, it actually to some extent worked, because they came from very solid educational backgrounds, so there wasn't a whole lot of loss there. But what we're finding as we do that today is that if you do that, you teach them English first, and then you have them do the cognitively interesting stuff, that they basically aren't really engaged in the whole learning process, and therefore won't learn the language very much either. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So in a sense, what we're saying is, if you want good language learning, you need the cognitive piece with it. And if you want good cognitive development, you need the language. They both push each other up at the same time. It's like the rising tide that lifts all boats, right? And that's basically how it works. So what does that have to do with the L1 use in the classroom discussion? We're finding that when students have very limited language development initially, and again, I'm talking about immigrant communities particularly here, but if they have very limited linguistic development, and you lower, because of the language, you lower the cognitive piece significantly because you're insisting on only speaking the language that they have to learn, English in the United States that is, that you really slow down the language development. So in other words, if you sometimes, if you can, and my students, my who are teachers currently, who teach in classrooms where not everybody speaks the same first language at home. So sometimes this is really tricky. But generally speaking, what happens is if they can refer to Spanish and just explain a difficult problem quickly in Spanish and then go back to English, that actually helps the student. Because you're not lowering the cognitive piece, you help prop up the cognitive piece at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same kind of thing like somebody else, it may have been you, Dalise, in another session actually, or in another conversation was saying to me, it's like, a difficult grammatical concept. Sometimes you just want to stop and just explain that quickly in the native language. And then they get it, and then you switch back to English.
Science?
Sorry?
What about using science to explain certain things?
Well, with science you can do less than with language. If we could do with science what we could do with language, we wouldn't be bothered. We would be out there having a drink right now. Here, and I'm not trying to ridicule what you're saying, but what I'm saying is that if sometimes the first language helps. If you do 50%, now it's way too much. But I also am very much, based on recent research, and 20 years ago, 15 years ago, people thought about this differently, including myself. But today we realize that actually some first language usage in the classroom really helps matters. And for you as teachers, you're going to have to make that call when you want to do that. In an EFL setting, I do it much less than in an ESL setting. But maybe I'd still do it to some extent. I wouldn't make it a mandate, oh, you can never do that. You have to, and similarly between your students, if you have two students that one student doesn't understand an assignment very well, another student does understand it, and they switch back to Spanish and they quickly explain to one another what's going on and then go back to English. There's nothing against that. There's actually everything to be said for that. But of course as teachers we want to have control of the classroom, right? So, and then they start talking and they keep talking in Spanish, and how do you stop them and so forth. So I understand all those things as well. But saying as a blanket statement, never any L1 usage in the classroom is probably not a good idea. It's probably not a good idea because we know that cognition is also important. That's the current thinking about that.
Would that also depend on the level and the learning, the objective of language learning? For example, I'm thinking about undergrad students who have to synthesize, analyze, summarize information directly in English to translate that into a paper, versus a language learner whose objective is just social interaction, let's say.
Absolutely.
I would probably stick to at least 99% English with the bachelor student and probably just introduce a little bit of Spanish, where it makes the teaching learning a little more efficient with the social, so to say, call it social learner.
Absolutely.
So
And I'm glad that you said that, because
absolutely, that's
please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying absolutely no first language in the classroom. That's not what I'm saying.
So
but it should be kept at a minimum.
Maybe he was referring to sign language. Because sign
that's
language
a
is
different story.
universal.
Yeah,
In Spanish and English, it's the same
Yeah.
thing. It's the same word. It's the same motion.
Yeah, but still, sign language you have to learn as well, right?
Yeah.
So that's nothing against. I'm just saying. I'm not disagreeing with what anybody's saying here. I'm just saying the way we think about that today is more nuanced. So consider that. Consider the cognitive aspect, the cognitive burden you place on people when you don't want to use the L1, and more importantly, the cognitive support that they're going to have sometimes when you do use the L1. There's no all or nothing on this at all.